In the meanwhile, the experiments continued in the United States, and they reached a level never before seen in any country, including the Soviet bloc. Entire populations bore the consequences of large-scale tests. Here are some examples, again, uncontested cases that are recognized by America. In 1953, radioactive iodine was injected into newborns and pregnant women at Iowa University and also in Nebraska. In 1955, the CIA sprayed bacteria that causes whooping cough off the coast of Tampa. 12 died and dozens fell ill. Also in 1955, the CIA enlisted prostitutes in San Francisco, opening 2 brothels and testing drugs on the clients. The sex was then filmed through a one-way mirror. In 1956, the army released millions of mosquitoes carrying yellow fever and dengue on the towns of Savannah and Avon. There were several deaths and hundreds of people were infected. In 1960, in Cincinnati, the Army financed a radiation program experimenting on 90 destitute or ill inhabitants in the city's university hospital. Some died after several weeks. In 1966, the Army tested a virus in the New York metro, then in Chicago. The microbes were concealed in light bulbs. The aim was to study the spread of biochemical agents on a large scale. For these experiments, the Army and the CIA funded laboratories in the most prestigious universities: Yale, Stanford, Harvard, Columbia. They all took part. Thrilled by the idea of working for the nation's defense, the researchers went wild.
Dr. Kligman in Philadelphia increases a dosage 468 times, which actually frightened Dow Chemical. They couldn't believe that a respected doctor would do that. In Washington, D.C., you had Walter Freeman, who was a very, very well-known lobotomist who traveled around the country doing lobotomies in his car. And he would use an ice pick. He could do 15 to 20 in a day. It was just incredible what some doctors did, and very few, if any, people in the hospital or the medical community blew the whistle on it. It really was an egregious act, and it showed that the medical community was more interested in protecting its than in protecting the test subject and the patients, because a lot of doctors went off the deep end and started doing things that are just inconceivable now.
To express his indignation, Alan Hornblum wrote half a dozen books. A former prison guard in Holmesburg, Pennsylvania, he was horribly shocked from his first day at work more than 40 years ago.
I was stunned to see scores of inmates with their shirts off, strapped and wrapped in bandages and gauze tape. And I couldn't imagine that I was going into an atmosphere that was that violent, because all of the men looked like they had just walked a cell block knife fight.
They explained that it was not the result of any violence, but rather the experiments that were carried out there. Alan was the first to condemn this scandal and would lose his job as a result.
It was probably the largest human experimentation factory in America, possibly the world. From 51 until 1974, more people were probably incorporated in more experiments than any other place in the world.
Drugs, viruses, cancerous cells, plutonium, sarin gas. The most toxic products were tested in Holmesburg, but also in dozens of prisons throughout the country. To denounce these experiments, Alan Hornblum found former inmates like Yusuf. In 1961, this man was imprisoned for selling cannabis. He was poor with limited education. He was offered a chance to take part in tests for $1 a day. Since then, Yusuf has had to have surgery on his digestive tract. He has liver and skin problems and can no longer work. His first test was for a bath foam for Johnson & Johnson.
No, she's locked up. She says, Pop, where are you?
They took tape and they stuck it on your back and pulled it off, stuck it on and pulled it off until the first layer of skin came off your back. And they put six sections on my back like that. And then they took a bottle with the Johnson & Johnson bubble bath in it and put it on a patch and put the patch over the raw area. Then they took a can. I recognized that can as being from the Army. And I was like, what Johnson & Johnson got to do with this? So he took the can and he sprayed it on my back. And when it hit my back, it was cold. But it was so toxic and like fumes, I could taste it in my mouth. And as I'm walking down, I'm getting dizzier and dizzier, dizzier and dizzier. By the time I stepped into my cell, I passed out. Boom, and my back was inflamed. And by the time I woke up that morning, I had great big blisters on my back full of pus. This rash just gets worse and worse. And it looks like when the moon come out at night, it flames up, and I'll be moaning and crying. My cell partners couldn't sleep.
There was a second test which would lead to surgery on his intestines, then a third where he had to do simple sums while drinking a colorless liquid.
We goes over there, a little shot cup, and it looked like water. We drinks it. Everything became magnified, the sound, like the loudspeaker on the system. Ooh, ooh, ooh. The walls look like they turned into water. You know what I mean? And like I spent the whole time like looking around like this here instead of doing the test. So I goes back to the block in that condition, and man, I mean, I was tripping, and it was like a slow-acting drug that was in that cup. It lasts for weeks. The inmates start naming me out of limits. I had no conversation for nobody. I was scared of the inmates, and the inmates act like they was afraid of me.
What you had were hundreds and hundreds of uneducated minorities, overwhelmingly black and Puerto Rican, and then you had white doctors with white lab coats with PhD or MD after their name, and it was a recipe for abuse, if not disaster. And those prison walls are an ideal spot to do controversial experiments, because just as those walls keep the inmates in, they also keep the public out, so no one finds out about it.
Prisoners were used, but also patients. In certain hospitals, patients were steered towards services financed by the CIA. These services carried out endless experiments on psychological manipulation. In 1965, Karen Wetmore was only 13 when she was admitted to a hospital in Vermont. She stayed there several times in her childhood. She suffered from severe depression after falling victim to a pedophile neighbor. Admitted against her will, she was not allowed any contact with her family, being told that it was for her own good.
The CIA was specifically looking for children between the ages of 13 and 18 to further dissociate. They wanted dissociative children. There's a sense of absolute and total helplessness. You're there, you're bound up, you're locked in this room. No matter how you scream, no matter what you say, no one is going to come. It does something to you, something you don't get over.
The doctors went to work on Karen. They wanted to wipe her memory and create a robot at their command.
flipped.
It took 30 years of legal battles for Karen to obtain her medical records and to discover the extent of the violent treatments she was subjected to.
It says seclusion, full cam. A cam is a straitjacket. And ties, which means they tied my arms and they tied my feet. This goes on uninterrupted, day after day, week after week, February, March, April, right up until June 21st, 1971. You sleep on the floor, no blanket, no nothing. And my arms were secured like this, behind my back. I do remember that. It's extremely painful because it pulls on your neck, pulls on your shoulder. You can't get away from it. It's maddening is what it is, maddening. And I was naked. And I think that was part of the effort of that experiment, to break me down. Everything they did was to break me down.
Months in a confined room with no bearings, while her captors administered all kinds of drugs and sometimes electric shocks at inhumane levels.
Number of shocks and the seconds that they held the shocks. 30, 30, 35, 35, 35, and they held it for, sustained for 40 seconds. A normal shock would be a second. Certainly not 30 and 35 of them. One, not that many, which probably is what obliterated my memory right there. And I think that's the way they did it. That's the way they did it. They also said, in this treatment right here, no seizure, shock, restarted. So they gave me a second one because they couldn't produce a seizure. So they must have done it over again, must have repeated it. It's unforgivable. And I'm sure I wasn't the only one they did this to. I'm sure. I survived to be able to talk about it. They used drugs like LSD. They used electric shock. They used chemical shock agent Metrazol, which I was given in 1971. And I found that out in my medical records, which is a very brutal drug, very brutal drug. CIA said it was excruciating, physically and emotionally, excruciating drug. I have a quote from the CIA that said that the Soviets used it in the gulags, and that a POW would say or do anything to avoid a second dose. Nice drug.
The imagination of scientists is limitless. In these images, a bull charges at a cape waved in front of him. A few moments later, an implant is placed in his brain, and he is released back into the ring. At each charge, he receives a shock that stops him in his tracks. Documents that are now declassified show that more sophisticated implants were tested on human subjects.
There's all kinds of people who believe and people who don't believe, and that's a debate about do you believe or don't believe. I'm always interested in what are in the documents saying. So the documents clearly describe implanting electrodes in people's brains, activating the electrode from a remote transmitter, and changing the person's behavior from angry, pounding the wall, sitting there just staring.